So I don't have any slides for you, so I'm just going to talk. I'm going to be talking about polyamory and mononormative assumptions in our culture. I'm sure some of you are already familiar with polyamory, but for those who aren't, I'm going to give a bit of explanation as to what it is. Polyamory is a fairly recent neologism, and because many people use it as an identity, there's a lot of different nuanced ideas about what polyamory means. Quite literally, it translates to many loves. And functionally, polyamory can be defined as the practice of having multiple concurrent, loving or romantic relationships with the knowledge and consent of everybody involved. And knowledge and consent are really key here, because if you don't have those, then it's just cheating, right? But polyamory is so much more than just a practice. It's also an identity, an orientation, a movement, a philosophy, a lifestyle, and a relationship model. While non-monogamous relationships have been the norm for a good portion of history, polyamory is a fairly new concept. The term was coined in the 90s by two different people independently. Jennifer Wesp, who founded the news group Alt Polyamory in 1992, and Morning Glory Zell in their article A Bouquet of Lovers. Some of the features of polyamory that distinguish it from other non-monogamous relationship models is that it focuses on emotionally connected romantic relationships. It's egalitarian, queer-friendly, and the culture places a lot of emphasis on safety and consent. So let's contrast this with some of the other commonly known non-monogamous relationship models. Open relationships, swinging, and traditional polygamy. Open relationship is a pretty big umbrella, but in mainstream culture, it generally refers to a couple with a primary relationship where one or both partners have permission to have lovers or casual sexual encounters outside of the primary relationship. Compared to polyamory, most people in open relationships maintain the primacy of the couple relationship, and frequently ongoing romantic connections are not desired or allowed. So you can have sex with other people, but you're not allowed to bring home another boyfriend or girlfriend. Swinging is another couple-centric activity that focuses on having recreational sex, typically with other couples, usually in an event-based setting. Swinging is a culture that's really distinct from polyamory, and it's a much larger and older movement, and it's mostly made up of middle-class heterosexual couples. Swinging is almost always done as couples, and while female bisexuality is highly prized in the swinging movement, many swinger groups are very hostile towards male bisexuality. Single women are often encouraged to attend swinging events, while single men are very often not welcome at all. Finally, traditional polygamy. Now, when we talk about traditional polygamy, we're really talking about polygyny. That's one man having multiple wives. Polygamy is practiced by some sects of Mormonism, Judaism, and Islam, so it's pretty well connected to religion. In all these cultures, men are permitted to have multiple wives, but women are never allowed to have multiple husbands, so it's not a very egalitarian model. In some cases, and I stress some, not all, polygamous marriages are arranged or coerced. I'm sure you've all heard of the fundamental Latter-day Saints community of Bountiful in BC, which was in court last year. In these communities, women may not have a say in who they marry, and a man's current wife or wives may have no input into their husband's future marriages. Bisexuality and homosexuality are generally not well received in these cultures, and a man's wives won't be romantically or sexually involved with each other. Now, polyamory comes in a lot of different flavors, and there's no one right way to do it. The concept of primary and secondary are pretty important in the polyamory community. Primary can refer to a relationship where partners are cohabitating or have a high practical investment in the relationship, or a relationship that is given priority over all others. Secondary can refer to non-cohabitating relationships, or relationships that are lower priority or have a lower level of commitment. Many people do this type of hierarchical poly in a prescriptive fashion, and many others do non-hierarchical poly where relationships form organically and just find their own level. A few common forms of polyamory are triads or quads, Vs or Ns, and networks. Triads or quads are groups of 3 or 4 people who are all involved with each other. Triads in particular are probably the most sought after and idealized model of polyamory, although they're pretty rare, and successful ones usually form organically rather than by design. We have a lovely, not so pleasant term in the poly community, unicorn hunters, which is a heterosexual couple seeking a bisexual female partner. Very, very common. V's and N's just describe a visual map of connections between people. V is 3 people, 2 of whom share the same partner but aren't involved with each other, and an N is basically just 2 V's stuck together. There's also W's and stuff like that. And networks are just what they sound like, a network of people who are connected by mutual partners but are not necessarily involved with each other. It's warm up here. So all of these forms can be either open, that is when one or more of the people involved are open to having new partners, or closed, where nobody in the group is open to, interested, or allowed to have additional partners. And some people do group relationships, and others keep all of their relationships separate. I also want to give a mention to monopoly relationships, where one partner is polyamorous and has multiple partners, and the other partner in the relationship is monogamous with their sole partner, which is a pretty challenging model, but surprisingly common. So why would anyone choose polyamory? The reasons are diverse as the people who practice it. For some, it's an orientation. It's really the only relationship model that feels comfortable and natural. Others come to it through as a strictly practical choice because they happen to be in love with 2 people. For others, it's about the freedom to let relationships grow organically, having sovereignty over one's own relationship choices, enjoying sexual and emotional variety or novelty, having multiple partners to meet a range of relationship needs, maintaining connection when the dynamic in a long-term relationship shifts, or any other number of things. So if you ask a poly person, a bunch of different poly people, why, you'll probably get a different answer from everybody. So I hope that gives everybody a basic understanding of polyamory. Were there any questions before I move on to the next section?
This isn't really a question, but you're talking kind of fast and it's hard to follow everything you're saying.
Sorry, I'll try to slow down a little bit.
Just talk a little louder. I don't know.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'd like to take a look at some of the mononormative assumptions we live with every day. What do I mean by mononormativity? Mononormativity basically means the normalization of monogamy. In a mononormative culture, which is what we live in, monogamy is the default relationship model. In spite of the rising popularity and visibility of non-monogamous relationship options, many people never question the inevitability and certainty of monogamy unless they're really given a good reason to do so. The most obvious way this manifests is that we tend to assume that people are monogamous unless they've given us a reason to believe otherwise. If we know or perceive that somebody's in a relationship, we generally assume that they're not available to date. And usually we assume that if a relationship becomes serious and committed, it's going to be a monogamous relationship. Alongside these assumptions, our culture tends to devalue non-monogamous relationships. There's the idea that when you find the right person, you'll settle down with them and be exclusive with them. And that implicitly denies the reality and legitimacy of non-monogamous relationships. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Relationships that are worth acknowledging are relationships that are monogamous, and we see this belief reflected in pretty much every space where we're asked for information on our partners. Government forms, medical forms, demographic data. There's pretty much always just one space to talk about one partner. Non-monogamy is also often pathologized. Non-monogamous people are often characterized as being immature, sexually promiscuous, unable to commit, unable to connect deeply with other people. And this is no more true of non-monogamous people than it is of the general population. In therapeutic settings, particularly in relationship counseling, non-monogamy is often blamed for any and all relationship issues, even if they're completely unrelated to being non-monogamous. You know, like fighting about money all the time, must be that non-monogamy. Can't agree on how to parent the kids, non-monogamy. Non-monogamous people also often receive flack from other healthcare professionals, such as doctors or nurses, who treat them as irresponsible vectors for STIs. Mononormativity manifests in our media and pop culture a great deal too. We see this in the lack of models for non-monogamous relationships in the media. Can anyone name 5 books, movies, TV shows, or games that portray committed, consensually non-monogamous relationships? 5, really?
A whole series of them from Howard Hyman.
Okay, yes. I was going to say, other than A Stranger in a Strange Land.
Mistress, covering Robert Jordan.
Yeah, it's not really out there.
But about 70% of Heinlein in one place or another.
Mm-hmm.
And often in large group settings of dozens of people.
Yeah,
whole Lazarus.
the line marriage system,
Not necessarily with marriage, but yeah, with groups and stuff. So, yep.
but not very common.
Not since he died.
Yes.
Have you heard of a movie called When Two Won't Do?
No, I have not.
It came out a decade ago. It was a movie about a couple. The woman, she was the polyamorous one, and her, I think she was her boyfriend. He was monogamous, and they tried to work it out, and there was interviews with them, and they met another couple that was also experimenting with. They were experimenting with polyamory. It didn't quite work out with another couple that had a tragic end. But I was just wondering, also if you know of any other movies that deal with that topic. That's the only one I've heard.
I can't name titles off the top of my head, but I know that Jorith curates an online list of movies and documentaries and other media that deals with polyamory, and there's also a Poly in the Media blog that discusses appearances of and discussions of polyamory that appear in media. So I can find you a link for that later if you'd like. Mononormativity also shows up in the common tropes in our culture around romance. There's the concept of a soulmate, your partner being your better half, and you really only get to have two halves, right? And this really pervasive idea of the one, this one person that if you can find them, they're going to be perfect for you, they were made for you, and they'll complete you, and everything will be perfect if you can only find them. And then we also have this idea that we can trade up partners. So we discard one and we hope the next one's going to be better. Whether it is or not is debatable. And then there's the conflict of having to choose between two people you desire or having to compete with another person for the person you desire. And I think this trope fuels pretty much half of the romantic stories ever written. So we also see this assumption in the way that things are marketed to us, products and services that are available for consumption. The couple is really the fundamental social unit, and as soon as you start to add more people to that, you run into issues. I mean, good luck booking a romantic getaway or a Valentine's Day dinner for 3 people. There's resorts, cruises, spa packages, dinners, entertainment, events, gifts, and way more that are designed specifically for 2 people with this couple unit in mind. Even if we move away from strictly romantic products and services, memberships and discounts for couples or for families with 2 or fewer adults plus children are really common. I mean, a cohabitating triad can't even get a Costco membership for everybody in the household. And how about the whole structure of marriage? It's a legal contract between 2 people, and it's also usually a declaration to society about the permanence and solidity of your relationship. In addition to that, it's a government-supported institution that automatically provides a lot of social benefits and legal benefits, such as inheritance rights, medical decision-making power, tax advantages, the right to share employee-provided benefits from work, just to name a few. And we are very firmly limited to one spouse at a time. If you wanted another one, you'd better get rid of the first one. This is written into the Criminal Code of Canada. Not only are you forbidden from being legally married to more than one person at a time, Section 293 of the Criminal Code actually prohibits living in a conjugal relationship with more than 2 people. So even if you don't have a marriage ceremony and you don't get legally married, simply by living with more than one partner, you are technically liable for up to 5 years in jail. Yeah. Yes.
Also note that what constitutes a conjugal relationship and whether you're in such a relationship is determined not strongly by fact, but actually by public opinion.
Yes, I mean, if you had 2 roommates and people had the wrong perception about your relationship,
they can declare a conjugal whether or not you've ever slept with any of them.
Yeah, I mean, how can you prove that, right? So when we start to challenge all the more non-normative assumptions in the culture, we really have to start assuming less and asking more questions. This is a process that starts internally, and then it can be extended to our romantic relationships, our social and professional lives, and how we influence the culture that we live in. So by being here today and hearing about this topic, you're taking a first step, because awareness is really important. Without it, mononormativity is only going to remain entrenched. If you've held on to stereotypes and stigmas around non-monogamous people, examine those and let them go. Non-monogamous people aren't a monolith. The only feature they all share in common is non-monogamy, and otherwise they are diverse as everybody else. You can check your languages and reactions, both internal and performed. A lot of people engage in slut-shaming language and behavior around people having multiple partners, which is really damaging and negative. A lot of statements are, not inclusive of non-monogamous people. A lot of social invitations are extended to couples specifically. So you can reconsider what you say and choose your language and your behavior in ways that don't prop up mononormativity or erase the existence of non-monogamous folk, because even if you don't know that you know them, you probably know some people who are non-monogamous. In our own personal romantic relationships, we can break down mononormativity by making fewer assumptions. So whether you end up choosing monogamy, polyamory, or any other form of non-monogamy, you can really consider your options and make a conscious choice rather than just defaulting to one relationship model. And don't assume that new partners are monogamous. Discuss up front with your new partners your desires and expectations around monogamy so that any agreements you have are explicitly negotiated. A recent study at Oregon State University found that 40% of couples didn't have a monogamy agreement that they actually both knew existed. So you really don't want to be in that 40%. And when you're in the dating pool, don't assume that everybody in a relationship is unavailable. While non-monogamous people are still a small subset of the population, we're out there and we are dating, and you may just miss out on a great connection if you continue to make this assumption. Non-monogamy is actually quite popular and prevalent in a lot of different subcultures. In our social and professional lives, we can ensure that non-monogamous people can feel safe being out. This is particularly important for polyamorous people because their relationships are about relationships and not just sex. So if people feel unsafe being out, then they may have to pretend that one of their partners doesn't exist, and I don't think anyone would really want to have to be in a position where they have to pretend that their spouse doesn't exist, right? If you meet non-monogamous people as you go about your day, treat them like normal human beings, not oddities. If you do creative work, make art, stories, music, articles, consider portraying non-monogamous people in a positive way. If you're in healthcare, get educated about non-monogamous people so that you can address their needs in your practice in a way that's not discriminatory. And if you're a consumer, you can ask for these sorts of things and then support them when they do exist. And if you are non-monogamous, be out about it if it's safe for you to do so. One of the major factors in the acceptance of homosexuality is people knowing somebody in their lives who identifies as gay or lesbian. It's far harder to stigmatize a group or to hang on to incorrect beliefs about them or to fear them when somebody that you happen to know and like belongs to that group. So it's a humanizing factor. There's also broader social change that you can be supportive of by raising the positive profile of non-monogamy on internet forums, commenting on news articles, and I mean, we've all seen how terrible comment sections of news articles usually are. Or writing letters to the editor. You can write to your elected representatives about laws that discriminate against or disproportionately impact non-monogamous people, and support the Canadian Polyamory Advocacy Association, which is involved in the ongoing charter challenge of Section 293, which I believe should be resolved around the end of this year. As you go about your life, just remember that relationship model preference is just one of the many beautiful facets of human diversity and one of the many facets that make up each individual. So whether you choose monogamy, polyamory, or anything else for yourself, a world of greater acceptance and less discrimination and a broader idea of what's normal is really a great thing to strive for. Thank you. Yes.
After watching the news, I would love to hear what a polyamorous perspective on polygamy would be. I don't know if you're ready to fully answer the question.
Polygamy in and of itself as a model isn't inherently harmful. Polygamy is just, having multiple spouses. I think most polyamorous people take issue with a lot of the ethics of traditional polygamy because it's not egalitarian and it's not consent-based, and there does tend to be a lot of coercion, even if not just on a personal level, a cultural level, where people don't have choice in the types of relationship models that they engage in. So because consent is such a strong an important factor in the poly community, that is definitely an issue of contention when it comes to traditional polygamy. And there's been some debate in the poly community about allying with traditional polygamists, especially in relation to challenging laws which affect both communities. But strictly as from an ethical standpoint and also from a public relations standpoint, that's generally been something that has been avoided because polygamy is far more well understood than polyamory, and they're such different ethical models. We don't want to be lumped in with traditional polygamists because that's just not, other than the multiple partners, we don't have much of anything in common with them. Yes, Jim?
It's not really a question, but I would like to hear more discussion, if you wouldn't mind, about... I'm sure that there is a lot of perception that people have, the reasoning behind slut-shaming, and health dangers and like that. Could you just discuss that and maybe pop some myths?
Okay, so slut-shaming and health issues. Oh, that's a really complex issue, and that really comes down to, I believe, entrenched sexism in our society, because men and women don't experience the same degree of slut shaming and just negative perception regarding their sexuality, especially promiscuous or with multiple partners. So, I mean, even the term slut is a very gendered term. It's almost always used to refer to women, and there's no real gendered male equivalent term. Okay, but I mean, player or stud. Oh, so offended, right? Stab at the heart. And how to approach that?
I know I just sort of threw a general...
Yeah. Do you have a specific question?
I'm sure that people probably... I've heard people bring up questions like, well, empirically, aren't you going to have larger incidence of STI in a polyamorous couple or an open relationship?
Okay. To address the
probability.
To address the STI issue, yes, there is the potential for more infection transmission when you have more partners, and a lot of health professionals will suggest monogamy as a safer sex strategy. But in the polyamorous community, people tend to be extremely well educated about STI prevention, what symptoms are, what precautions you can take, just statistics around, risk factors. So there tends to be a lot of communication around discussing safer sex and negotiating these things. So I think in a lot of ways, the polyamorous community tends to be safer than the general public because there is so much focus on preserving your own health and protecting that of your partners and the general community, whereas a lot of people in the general population have very lax safer sex practices or extremely misinformed about STIs and how to prevent them.
I can imagine that if you think you're in a monogamous relationship and you're actually not, you're probably more at risk than if you know you're in a polyamorous relationship.
Absolutely. Especially since a lot of people, when they're cheating, I've heard of people doing these like weird mental gymnastics where it's like, if I don't use a condom, then it's not premeditated, and therefore it's not as bad. And a lot of people won't, especially in cheating situations, a lot of people won't have safer sex discussions because it increases the feeling of being premeditated, whereas if it feels very spontaneous, then it's easier to excuse. Right in the back?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm planning a formal gathering, and so I'm guilty of this. I put on invitations, so-and-so kind of guest. Mm-hmm. But I want to be sensitive to this sort of situation, while at the same time excluding the children from coming along, or pretty good buddies to have a good time.
You don't want somebody showing up with 10 people, right?
Exactly. Well, whatever the case might be, I'm trying to be somewhat exclusionary, but at the same time accommodating. What's a tactful way of phrasing an invitation?
A lot of people I know who hold social events say partners are welcome, friends by request, or something to that effect, and that usually fairly disincludes children, right? Unless it's a child-friendly event. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, that's great.
Behind you?
You mentioned that polyamory is more prevalent or more common in certain subcultures of society.
Yes.
Could you name some of those?
The question was which subcultures is polyamory more prevalent in. Polyamory seems to be very popular in the pagan community, amongst people who are in the SCA. The kinky community has a very high rate, lots of polyamorous people in it. There are a lot of geeks in the polyamorous community. There is actually quite a lot of polyamorous people in the skeptic community. I'm not sure how much overlap there is, but noticeable to me anyway. What else? Apparently Microsoft used to employ a very large number of polyamorous people.
Correlation, causation?
I don't know. I don't know correlation, causation for sure, but I've heard some people say that the general demographics of founding members of a movement tend to reflect the future members of said movement often, and early people in the polyamorous community tended to be pagan or geeks, and I think there was a lot of networking happening at Microsoft, I guess. Ashlyn.
How often are people prosecuted under Section 293?
I don't think there's actually ever been a successful prosecution. If there has, it's fewer than you can count on one hand, but it still exists and could pose a legal issue for somebody.
Do you have a number on, say, a prevalence rate of polyamory in Canadians or something?
Ooh. I actually don't. It's really hard to find accurate statistics because most people are closeted. The Poly Leadership Network has been talking about doing a census of people who are involved in organized polyamory communities and groups, just to get demographics. That hasn't happened yet, and that also isn't going to capture any people who just practice it but aren't involved in groups.
Are you saying it's not on the long form census?
It should be. So yeah, I don't have any concrete numbers for you, unfortunately. I think you had your hand up first.
I was just wondering, a lot of celebrities have come out with gay recently. Is there any celebrities you know that are open about being polyamorous?
Tilda Swinton is probably the most prominent person that is openly polyamorous. I believe Warren Buffett had a polyamorous relationship. I could be wrong about that. I'd have to look it up.
Dan Savage, polyamorous?
Dan Savage is monogamish. Yeah, Charlie Sheen had his two goddesses for a while. Is there time for one more question?
I just wanted to know, you said there was the Canadian Polyamory Organization.
Canadian Polyamory Advocacy Association. I believe their URL is polyadvocacy.org. .something. And if anyone's interested in more resources, you can find us at polywinnipeg.com. There is a thread in our forum, in the general discussion forum, with lots of listed resources, books, websites, organizations, and so forth.
Cool.
Thank you.